At the end of the 19th century, the Congo was not yet an independent state. It was considered the personal property of King Leopold II of Belgium. Behind his image as a civilized sovereign hid a man obsessed with wealth. Gold, ivory, and especially rubber became his fortune, built on the blood and suffering of the Congolese people. Colonists imposed impossible rubber quotas on villages. For every unmet quota, the consequences were horrifying. The punishments were not only physical, they were designed to terrify the entire population. Mutilations, beatings, slavery, and in the most infamous cases, the cutting off of hands or arms. These atrocious acts were not merely gratuitous violence. Each severed hand was a message of terror, a brutal warning: obey or you will suffer. Villages lived in constant fear. Men, women, and sometimes even children were forced to travel miles into the forest, armed with a few rudimentary tools to harvest latex from rubber trees. Those who failed or tried to flee were severely punished, sometimes executed. Entire families were decimated, and generations were left traumatized. And yet, resistance existed. Many fled to remote areas, while others hid in the forest for weeks, sometimes months, to escape the brutality of the colonists. Despite the oppression, the Congolese people clung to their identity, culture, and traditions, refusing to be reduced to mere production tools. The system of terror implemented by Leopold II left deep scars on the country. These traumas are still passed down today in the collective memory of the Congo, in the stories of ancestors, in the villages and families that survived. Children grew up hearing terrifying tales about the colonists, stories of missing neighbors, mutilated parents, and destroyed villages. These stories, often whispered by the fireside, were not merely memories, they were lessons, warnings, but also invisible scars shaping Congolese youth. In some regions, the forests themselves became sacred refuges. Families who escaped the colonists built makeshift shelters there, living for weeks in constant fear of being discovered. Rivers and marshes were used to hide, sometimes even to bury those who had been killed or mutilated, as bodies could not be left visible to avoid public terror and humiliation. Despite the daily horror, acts of bravery and solidarity multiplied. Villagers shared their meager provisions with those fleeing violence. Elders taught the young to recognize signs of danger in the forest, to recognize the songs and footsteps of soldiers, and to pass on stories from the past so that memory would never disappear. Some women took on leadership roles to organize protection groups, hiding children and vulnerable men, passing on survival strategies that seemed simple but saved lives. The rubber trade also profoundly disrupted village social structures. Family bonds were broken, brothers and sisters separated, fathers and mothers forcibly taken from their children, sometimes never to return. Villages had to learn to live with loss and absence, rebuilding communities in fear and mistrust. Some turned to the forest as a new home, while others migrated to less controlled areas, forming clans and alliances to resist oppression. The violence and mutilations also left lasting physical and psychological marks. Survivors carried their wounds as marks of memory. Mutilations became visible stigmas, but invisible traumas, such as constant fear and distrust of strangers, were silently passed from generation to generation. It is said that some children were afraid to touch the rubber trees, fearing that it would recall the horrors of the past. Sometimes, the accounts recount acts of revenge or self-organized justice. Villages attacked colonist outposts to free captives, recover supplies, or simply to show that they had not been completely broken. Even under terror, the spirit of rebellion was never fully extinguished. Songs, dances, and ancestral rituals continued in secret, preserving history and cultural identity against the systematic eradication intended by the colonists. The economic consequences were equally devastating. People were deprived of their traditional means of subsistence. Forests, plundered for latex, were devastated, and some species disappeared. Villages had to learn to cultivate their land, often impoverished by forced exploitation, and rebuild what had been destroyed by Leopold II's thirst for wealth.
Over time, entire generations grew up with the sense that security and freedom were impossible luxuries. And yet, despite this oppression, Congolese culture survived. Griots, storytellers, musicians, and artists continued to pass on coded stories, resistance songs, legends, and symbols of courage. These stories were a way to keep alive the spirit of those who had suffered, a bridge between a painful past and an uncertain future. The traumas were not limited to those who had directly experienced the horrors. Subsequent generations grew up with the memory of the absent, parents, brothers, and sisters who had disappeared, often never to be found. In some families, there were children whose father or mother had been killed for failing to meet rubber quotas. These children grew up with a sense of emptiness and injustice, wondering why their human inheritance had been reduced to statistics to enrich a king far from their land. Women, for their part, endured hardships often invisible in historical accounts. Many were forced to work in the forest, sometimes alongside men, but often they had to carry children while harvesting latex, all while suffering physical or sexual violence from colonists and certain soldiers. These sufferings left deep scars, because beyond the physical mutilations, there were psychological wounds difficult to heal. Yet, resistance took many forms. Some groups organized secret networks to help those attempting to escape or to recover abducted children. Others used intimidation tactics against the colonists, striking when least expected, a silent but powerful act of courage. In some areas, people managed to delay rubber collection or sabotage the colonists' tools just enough to survive without being detected. Education, even informal, became a tool of resistance. Elders taught the young to read signs of danger in the forest, to recognize the songs and footsteps of soldiers, and to pass on stories from the past so that memory would never disappear. Tales, proverbs, and songs were not just entertainment, they were coded lessons on survival, solidarity, and resilience. This systematic terror left deep scars on the social structure of communities. Entire villages were destroyed or displaced, forcing survivors to rebuild their lives from scratch. Alliances between families and clans transformed into protective networks, each safeguarding its members and those of others as best as possible. This solidarity became a vital necessity for continuing to exist in a world where danger could arise at any moment. Even after the colonial era, the effects of this exploitation continued to be felt. The richest rubber lands were degraded, some forests disappeared, and the loss of traditional knowledge weakened certain communities. Psychological and culturally transmitted traumas created a climate of mistrust towards authorities, strangers, and sometimes even oneself. Yet at the heart of this pain, there were stories of courage that defy oblivion. Children who survived the violence grew up to become leaders in their villages. Women who lost family members founded support communities, and men forced to work in the forest passed on their knowledge so that no one would forget. Every survivor was a living proof that life could persist despite horror, and that the Congolese identity could never be completely erased. Some accounts even speak of miraculous recoveries in extraordinary resilience, families reunited with members long missing, entire villages rebuilt in the heart of the forest, and generations learning to transform trauma into collective strength. Even after years of terror, some villages found ingenious ways to survive. Communities learned to harvest rubber in secret, using hidden forest paths, taking turns to watch for soldiers, and devising codes to signal danger. These codes could be simple knocks on a tree, coded songs, or arrangements of stones visible only to villagers. Each cautious act was a small triumph against a system designed to crush their humanity. Children, often left to their own devices when their parents were sent into the forest or punished, developed incredible resilience. They observed, learned to hide, move silently, and sometimes even protect younger siblings. Some accounts tell of 10 or 12-year-old children guiding groups of villagers across rivers and marshes, avoiding capture and saving lives. Congolese women played a central but often forgotten role in this struggle. They organized improvised care networks, tending to the wounded and mutilated in secret. They made bandages from cloth and local plants, passing on ancestral medicinal knowledge to compensate for the absence of formal care. Some women even risked negotiating with colonial soldiers, using their courage and cunning to protect their families. These acts, though often invisible in history books, were crucial for village survival. The violence was not limited to physical mutilations. Colonists also used psychological terror strategies. For instance, villagers were sometimes forced to witness public punishments or carry the mutilated bodies of their loved ones, creating an atmosphere where fear became pervasive. Mental traumas were as devastating as physical injuries, and they were transmitted from generation to generation through stories, silence, and fear. Despite all this, Congolese culture found ways to survive and thrive. Ancestral songs and dances, sometimes banned by the colonists, continued to exist clandestinely. Griots, storytellers, and elders played an essential role. They preserved.
Confused and tired, some abandoned the pursuit. But the most perilous moment comes when an armed colonist, more vigilant than the others, discovers part of the network of hiding spots. A silent confrontation follows. Yema, trembling but determined, uses everything she has learned, diverting attention with noises, guiding the villagers to a safe path, and hiding behind trunks and vegetation. A stick narrowly misses her, but she keeps running, every breath burning in her chest. The children, courageous, participate actively. One of them, Luma, creates a bold diversion by imitating the cry of a wild animal, scaring the colonists and giving Yema time to guide the last villagers to safety. Every gesture is crucial. Every decision can save or cost a life. At dawn, as the sun begins to pierce through the branches, the village realizes it has survived the night. Despite the violence and danger, no one was captured. The villagers gather silently, watching Yema and the children. For the first time, fear is no longer absolute. A glimmer of pride and courage shines in their eyes. Yema looks around, breathless but invincible in her determination. She understands that resistance is more than a physical fight. It is memory, strategy, and solidarity. Every action they have taken, every life protected, every courageous deed becomes a spark of hope for the future. As the wind blows through the forest and the village slowly resumes its daily activities, Yema knows one thing: the struggle is far from over. But from now on, fear will no longer dictate their lives. She has planted in the hearts of the children and villagers the certainty that their memory and courage are indestructible, and that even the chains imposed by the colonists can never completely break them. The following weeks become a true test for the village. The colonists, frustrated by their inability to fully control the forest and the secret paths, increase their brutality. Every morning, blows resound, screams pierce the air, and the people begin to understand that they can rely only on themselves. Yema, now more determined and strategic than ever, decides to act with unprecedented audacity. She gathers the children and a few trusted adults and devises a plan to divert a patrol larger than usual while rescuing a group of recently captured villagers. "This time, we must be fast, silent, and precise," she whispers. "Every move counts. We cannot fail." As night falls, the forest becomes a labyrinth of signals and tricks. The children have placed branches, leaves, and stones to create false trails. The older ones use whistles and discreet cries to guide the colonists toward empty areas. Yema, Kito, and a small group infiltrate the colonists' camp to free the villagers. The tension is extreme. Every step could alert the guards. Every breath could be heard. But Yema moves forward, her heart pounding, guided by the memory of the stories her father told her. She knows this moment could change the life of her village. Inside the camp, they find exhausted men and women, tied and humiliated. The children help untie them, while Yema keeps watch over the patrols. But suddenly, a cry rings out. A colonist has discovered their presence. "Run!" Yema shouts. A frantic race through the trees begins. Sticks strike the ground, sticks fly past bodies. But thanks to their knowledge of the forest and the prepared diversions, the group manages to escape, dragging the villagers to the safety of secret hiding places. However, the victory comes at a cost. One of the teenagers, Luma, is seriously injured.
Yema, supporting him in her arms, feels a burning anger toward the colonists, but also deep sorrow. She knows the price of freedom is high, but she refuses to give in to despair. "We will continue, even for you," she whispers, holding Luma close. "Every life saved is a step toward our freedom." The next day, the entire village begins to murmur quietly. Yema and the children dared what the adults no longer imagined. Their courage inspires those once paralyzed by fear. The elders start organizing the protection of the porters, hiding the harvests, and preparing the next action with more strategy than ever. Yema understands that resistance is no longer just a daily act of survival, but a movement growing in the shadows, invisible to the colonists' eyes, but powerful in the hearts of the people. Every gesture, every detour, every simulated cry becomes a weapon. And in the silence of the forest, amidst the nocturnal sounds and shifting shadows, Yema feels a truth erupt in her mind. They are not alone. The memory, courage, and unity of their people are already more powerful than the chains imposed by the colonists. But she also knows that the challenges ahead will be even greater, and that the road to freedom is long, strewn with sacrifices, losses, and difficult choices. And yet, she is ready. She and her network of young resistors are ready to do whatever it takes to protect their people and pass on their story to future generations. As the sun rises over the village, Yema and the children watch the forest. The traces of the colonists are everywhere, but they have survived. The injured porters are cared for, the secret caches have protected the harvests, and the silent courage of the village has become an invisible but indestructible force. Yema looks around, her heart full of pride, but also questions. How much suffering can a people endure before they rise up? How does the memory of a people, passed down from generation to generation, become a weapon against oppression? And how many sacrifices are necessary for justice and dignity to prevail? The story of Yema and her village does not end here. It continues in every child's gaze learning to observe, every tale told by the fireside, every act of silent courage. Resistance is not measured only by strength, but memory, solidarity, and courage that grow even in fear. This story reminds us that behind every photograph, behind every historical document, there are lives, sufferings, and invisible heroes. Colonization left deep scars, but it also revealed the indomitable strength of those who refuse to be silenced. And today, we ask ourselves, how do we preserve the memory of past injustices? How do we transform fear and oppression into courage and action? And what can we learn from Yema and these children to protect our dignity and that of future generations? The history of the Belgian Congo is not just of an oppressed people, but of a silent and eternal resistance, inviting us to reflect, remember, and act.